and welcome to the final chapter of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm going to break this down into two parts because it's quite a lengthy chapter. It's the longest chapter in the book, and I think that's important because when you see the title, which is Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case, you realise there's an awful lot that that the reader needs to understand. Obviously, from the title of this chapter, we can see that this is Henry Jekyll's own words. So if you remember from chapters 1 through to chapter 8, we've had a third person narrator, but it's taken the bias, as we know, of Mr. Utterson. We then came to chapter 9, the last chapter, and that was Dr. Lanyon's account. And that was important because it was the first time that we, as the reader, heard about the transformation between Jekyll and Hyde. So this final one now is from the words of Henry Jekyll himself. Now, don't forget, it comes in the form of a written statement that he wrote before he was found dead. So if you remember right, at the end of chapter 8, when Utterson and Paul found him dead, or Hyde rather dead, in the middle of the floor in the cabinet, there were two envelopes with him. One of them that had Dr. Lanyon's letter in there, and then this second one here that's got Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case in here. So it was written just probably some days or weeks, we're not quite sure when, but sometime just before he died. But it takes us right back to the start of the events, not the story, because if you remember the story, the novel began with the story of the door, with Enfield telling Utterson about the strange man, Mr. Hyde, that he'd seen who trampled over the girl. So this is taken right back to the start of the events. And it begins with Jekyll telling us about the very early experimentation that he started doing to look into this dual nature of man, so these two sides of man. And when we talk about the dual nature of man, we're thinking about this idea that everybody within them has some kind of good and some kind of evil. Evil's probably too strong a word, but certainly that everybody has got the ability to do wrong. And it all stems back to if you believe in God, it's the idea that everybody is made with some kind of sin. Is actually born with some kind of sin in them. And it's this idea that he wanted to try and separate the two beings from each other. But we'll come to that in a moment because it does go into quite a lot of detail. So as I said, I'm going to read the first half of the chapter, which is about 6 pages. So it's quite long anyway compared to some of the other earlier chapters that have only been a page or two long. Okay, but it does fill in a lot of the gaps. So you will need to really concentrate on this because it takes us right back through Henry Jekyll's full account of how his experimentation began. But as I've already said, remember it's first person narrative told from the point of view of Henry Jekyll, and it's all written down. And you imagine Utterson sitting in his house after all the events of the evening, where they've broken into the cabinet and the body's been found, and he's found these letters. He's sitting now back at his own home reading these letters. So imagine him reading this to himself. Okay. So chapter 10, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. I was born in the year 18 to a large fortune, endowed besides with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every guarantee of an honourable and distinguished future. So right from the start then, Henry Jekyll is telling us that he was born into a wealthy family. So it was a large fortune. So there's a wealthy family. And his nature, as he says here, he was endowed. Endowed just means that you are given, you are blessed with excellent parts. And so he talks about the fact that inclined by nature to industry means that he was hardworking. Fond of the respect of the wise. In the words, he liked to be respected. So he was born into a good family, and he had a lot of good traits. And as he refers to himself here, with every guarantee of an honourable and distinguished future. Now, distinguished future means somebody that perhaps gets a good reputation, gets a good name for doing something good in the world. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high, and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Now, he says here, and when he talks about the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, it kind of means that there's almost a quite a fun, a good-humoured side to him, a gaiety of disposition. Disposition just means about your personality. Gaiety just means a happiness, and the impatient gaiety means that there's almost like quite an exuberant sense of fun about him. And he refers to that as the worst of his faults, and he thinks that it's the worst of his faults because, as he said, it made the happiness of many. So other people have been happy to have had such an excitable personality, but for him, it went against. It was hard to reconcile. It means that the two don't match. So this very grave countenance, this serious personality that he wanted to show the world, didn't match with this excitement that he felt within him. Um, so we can see here, this is quite an interesting point in terms of the context. It's this idea that as a Victorian gentleman born into a good family, he would be expected to behave in a very austere, serious, grave, stern sort of way. But his natural personality means that he's quite excitable. He likes fun. He likes to have a good time. And he says the two kind of don't work together. All right, and that's why he refers to it as being a fault, which suggests that his actual nature is one of excitement, but his nurture, so the way he's been brought up, has doesn't allow that kind of excitement. He has to be quite serious about things. Hence, it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. Now, that's a very, very important quote, that one there. What he's saying here is that basically that when he got to a certain age and began to look around him, look around at himself, and the way that he'd moved through the world, his progression and position in the world, he says that he realized that he committed a profound duplicity of life. In other words, if you're duplicitous, it means that you lie. So there's two sides to him. That on the outside, he's trying to be this very serious and stern gentleman, but on the inside, actually, he has a very different view of life. He perhaps thinks wicked things, or he thinks excitable things that would have been considered vices at the time for the Victorians. Many a man would have even emblazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. So he's saying here that a lot of people, when it talks about emblazoned such irregularities, it means that they would have been quite obvious. They'd have been quite outgoing about the things that they did and the fun that they enjoyed. But as he says here, he says. He talks about from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with a sense of shame. In other words, he set himself very, very high standards and high expectations. He set himself up in front of the world as being this very austere man. So he's almost tricking himself. And this was very, very common for the Victorians, that on the outside, that they played this very stern part, but actually behind closed doors, it was a much darker life, and much more sort of frivolous and fun life that the Victorians led. But they were very embarrassed to admit that. So on the outside, it was all very stern, and on the inside, there was probably a lot more going on than they admitted. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was. And with even a deeper trench than the majority of men, severed in me those provinces of good and evil which divide and compound man's dual nature. Now, that's again a very, very important quote where he's talking about these two sides of the human personality. The fact that he's having to hide the one behind the other means that he's almost living a lie when he talks about this man's dual nature. And that's a phrase that we've talked about quite a lot in class, the idea of the dual nature, the dual meaning two sides. So these two sides of man. And this obviously gives you an idea, or should start to give you an idea, as to why the idea of his creation of Mr. Hyde came about. The idea that man is not just one person, but two very different people. The fact that we hide things from the world that we perhaps don't show people because we know that it's wrong, either morally or legally wrong. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterately on that hard law of life which lies at the root of religion, and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame than when I laboured in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. So he's saying here that really this he almost felt as though this kind of goes against religion, the idea that he's not just a good person through and through, that he's got some kind of other desires that behind the facade that he hides. But actually, that's not true because this is true of everybody. I think certainly everybody has these two sides and the things that they don't necessarily show people because they know it's wrong. And obviously, we have our upbringing, we have schools, we have the law, we have morality, realizing that it's not right to say and do things, even though we might think them. And as he says here, he wasn't a hypocrite. Both sides of his personality he felt totally at ease with. So when, as he says here, he says that when he laid aside restraint, now restraint is where you stop yourself from doing it. So if he laid it aside, it's when he perhaps gave in to some of the more unpleasant things that he wanted to do. We're not talking about really, really harsh things here. But you need to remember the Victorians were very austere, very serious about things. So even things that perhaps, I don't know, getting drunk or perhaps eating rich food, these were sort of things that they would have classed as being immoral or wrong at this time. So he's saying that when he threw aside restraint and plunged in shame, actually he felt quite happy about it, and it felt that it was part of his nature. But equally, when he laboured in the eye of day, so when he worked very hard and kept himself very honest and upright, that also felt very much like him too. And we can see here the problem in that Jekyll at the time, before the experimentation began, felt that the two weren't right, that the person shouldn't be both good and evil, that we should only be good. But actually, he's ignoring the fact that this is just part of man's nature. This is who we are. And it chanced that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly towards the mystic and transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light on this consciousness of the perennial war among my members. So he's talking here about the beginnings of his medical studies, so this scientific studies. Transcendental means things that go above and beyond the real world that we can see. So this is where we can see that his early experimentation started to lead him down routes that were perhaps a little bit less commonplace or ordinary in the world of science and medicine at the time. So he starts to kind of think of um, a, a wider world out there, really, other possibilities. And this again is important because, as we know at the time, science and religion were kind of in battle against each other because there was a lot of scientific and medical advancement that seemingly at the time went against religion. If we just think back to the 1860s with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which basically led the belief that man was not created in its common form in the image of God, but actually was evolved from apes and from lower forms of life even before that, which obviously goes against the idea that man was created in God's image. So we can see here that religion is starting to play quite a strong feeling in his views, and that this idea that science and medicine was very much going against the very traditional views of religion. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Um, Now here, this is where he's saying that he in the early days he realised that mentally and emotionally, man isn't just one person but two. And he says, "I say two because my knowledge does not pass beyond that point." He's wondering even whether future scientific exploration or medical exploration, especially of the mind and the brain, would reveal that humans are not just even two personalities, but they're also perhaps that there are multiple personalities that people hide. And it's interesting that he refers to this discovery of man being two rather than one. He refers to it um, as being a discovery. I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck. So the words doomed and shipwreck suggest that this discovery that he made, this realization that man is not one but two, has actually led to his doom. So it led to his end, really. And of course, if you're shipwrecked, it means that you are kind of abandoned at sea and you're lost at sea. So metaphorically, he feels as though he's kind of lost his life, he's lost at sea effectively. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. So he's talking about future psychology and the belief that he thinks that people will come after him and they'll realise that we are not just two. Our personalities don't just have a two-way split, but multifarious. In other words, there are many that our personality takes many forms. Now, I mean, this book was written not far of 150 years ago, 140 years ago, and even today, even though we've made massive leaps forward in terms of looking at the brain and psychology and the way that we think and the way that our personalities are formed, there is still a very, very long way to go. The brain is still the most complex and unknown of all of our organs. So even now, we psychologists truly don't understand the human brain, and it probably won't forever, really, because it's such a complex state. It was on the moral side and in my own person that I learned to recognise the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. And from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle, I had learned to dwell with pleasure as a beloved daydream on the thought of the separation of these elements. Now, this is it sounds quite complex, but basically what he's saying is that he he's realised that his brain has these two, or his personality has these two very different sides, because he has the two sides. So when he's in his very rational mind, he can see what he does as sinful, and equal when he's sinful, he can see the other side of him. So it's only by embracing both sides that of his personality that he realises he has both. And as he says, that he started to dwell on the thought of the separation of these elements. So, in other words, trying to separate the good side of his personality from the less good, from the less savoury, the slightly more evil side of it. If each, I told myself, could be but housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of his extraneous evil. So what he's saying here is kind of saying that if he could separate the two sides of the personality in different houses, in other words, different bodies, the one that perhaps was the more evil side can actually go their own way. And as he says, the unjust just means, if you're just, it means that you're lawful. If you're unjust, it means that you're unlawful or wrong, or whether that's actually in terms of the legal sense, or whether that just means in terms of the immoral sense, it's not quite clear. But either way, he says that the unjust, or the evil side, as we know later to become Hyde, might go his way, delivered of the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin. In other words, the evil side can go his own way and do what he wants, free of the judgment and the remorse of the good side of him. So you imagine that perhaps if you do something a little bit naughty, a little bit wrong, and the good side of you is going, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." He's saying that the less savoury person, the evil person, can actually go their way free of any kind of conscience, free of being told what was right and wrong by the other half of them. And equally, the good side of him can go his way without falling into sin, and without feeling that they then do something wrong. So it's his early view of the experimentation was his way of freeing the two sides of the personality from judgment from the other. I mean, you imagine if perhaps you were thinking of doing something wrong, but thought, no, I'm going to do something good. I'm not going to do that. And then the other side of you is going, well, that was a bit stupid. That was a bit pathetic, wasn't it? Why didn't you do that? So it's his way of saying that he wanted to split the two of them so they could actually live independently without the judgment of the other. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were thus bound together. Incongruous means things that don't fit together, don't match. That is the agonised womb of consciousness. These polar twins should be continuously struggling. How then were they disassociated? So this is obviously, he's thinking back to the early form of his experimentation, wondering how it is that he can try and split these two parts of the personalities that can go their separate ways physically. I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a sidelight began to shine upon the subject from the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever yet been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of this seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. So he's saying that in the early part of his experimentation, he started to realise that maybe the physical part of us as humans, as opposed to the soul or the personality, even though it seems very solid, actually is something that could be quite transient. It actually could be something that can be changed. So he's starting to play around with the physical form and wondering how far he can take it in terms of splitting the two. Certain agents I found to have the power to shake and to pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. Agents are talking about powders. So he's saying that early on in his experimentation, certain powders, certain formulas did actually change his physical form a little bit. So he's kind of talking us very gradually through the trail of experimentation he did that got him to where he was by the end of the story. For two good reasons, I will not enter deeply into this scientific branch of my confession. So he's not going to tell us in writing what it was that he did, what powders they were, and then he goes on to explain why. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders. And when the attempt is made to cast it off, but returns upon us with more unfamiliar and more awful pressure. Second, because as my narrative will make, alas, I too evident, my discoveries were incomplete. So he's saying the two reasons why he won't write it down on paper as to what form his experimentations took is because he has learnt the lesson and he doesn't want anybody else to have to learn that lesson. And the second reason is because as he says here, his experimentation was incomplete. So he doesn't want to tell people what he did because he doesn't want anybody else doing this half job that he, and of course we know that's because he didn't achieve the full sort of switch between the two. And we're going to explain why, because this the switch between Jekyll and Hyde as one person isn't what he intended to do. And he goes into detail into that in a little moment. So just watch out for that. Even then, that I not only recognised my natural body for the mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers made up my spirit, but managed to compound a drug by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and countenance substituted, none the less natural to me because they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements of my soul. So he's saying here that in this early experimentation, he realised that actually he could physically change his body using a certain compound of a drug that he discovered. And as he says here, that the second form that he took, which we know to be Hyde, was nonetheless natural to him. In other words, it felt quite natural because, as he says, they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements of my soul. So in other words, this person Hyde that came out wasn't somebody completely new to him. It was something buried deep within him. It bore the elements of lower elements of my soul. In other words, that these very base, unpleasant elements of him that had been hidden came out when he took the transformation into Hyde in the early days. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death, for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity, in other words the body, might be the least scruple of an overdose, or at the least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. So, very wordy here, but what he's basically saying here is that he hesitated for quite a long time before he decided to take the potion himself. And the reason being, he says here, that it might blot out the immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. So he was worried that if he took the potion and changed the first time, he wouldn't be able to go back to his other self, or the experimentation wouldn't work. So for quite some time he didn't do it. He understood the theory, he had the means to do it, but he was frightened to take it because he was worried that he wouldn't be able to change back to Jekyll. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound, and at last overcame the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. A tincture is another word for a potion. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt, which I knew from my experiments to be the last ingredient required. And late one accursed night I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. Now, he refers here to this salt that he purchased from the wholesale chemist. Now, if you remember, we've heard about this salt from a wholesale chemist before, because it was that he was desperately seeking in chapter 8. So we know that this salt that he got from this one wholesale chemist, he didn't realise it at the time, but this is the one ingredient that was impure. There was some form of impurity, so something extra that had been added to it by somebody further down the line at the wholesale chemist, that he didn't know what it was. He didn't know it was in there. He doesn't know what it was, and it was that, whatever it was, that imbalance, that impurity, that was the final thing that made the experimentation work. Okay, so this is the very first time that he took it, and look what happens. The most racking pangs succeeded, a grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. So this here is just talking about the very first time that he turned into Edward Hyde. And if you notice that the early descriptions of the change are very, very graphic, they're very unpleasant. It's talking about the grinding of the bones and the twitching of the body. But when he comes out the other side, when the changes occurred, he talks about how there was something strange in my sensations. He refers to it as indescribably new and incredibly sweet. So the first time that he turned into Hyde, he didn't feel bad about it. He didn't feel something unpleasant when he was Hyde. He describes it as sweet. He says that he felt younger, lighter, happier in body. He talks about a solution of the bonds of obligation. Now, solution means, as in, if something's soluble, it means that it dissolves. So that the bonds of obligation have dissolved. In other words, all these ties to his old life of being good and moral and upright and doing the right thing have dissolved. So he feels free, and that's the key to this. That when he was Hyde, he felt no conscience whatsoever. He talks about how he was more wicked, tenfold more wicked. Tenfold means 10 times. So he feels within himself that there's a wickedness about him. And he refers to himself as being sold a slave to my original evil. And this is a reference to the Bible. It's the idea that in Eve sort of taking the apple in the Garden of Eden, she introduced mankind to what we call original sin. And it's the idea that when she took that apple in the Garden of Eden, it made all men sinful. Every person carries sin because Eve didn't do what God told her to do. She took the apple when she shouldn't have done. And this idea of original sin is this religious belief that everybody carries original sin, and we have to do everything we can in our lives to try and account for that, to try and be good. And he's saying here that literally he sold himself as a slave to original sin. In other words, he's forgotten all of these bonds of obligation of the law and of his conscience, and of being a Victorian gentleman. And actually, he's now 100% evil. He's entirely wicked, as he refers to himself. And at the end of that paragraph there, he says, I was suddenly aware that I'd lost in stature. Now, stature, if you remember, means height and build. So as we've seen all the way through, Edward Hyde is constantly being referred to as being smaller in height and in size than Jekyll. Right? The reason for that being, of course, is that as Dr. Jekyll, if you think about the good side of Jekyll, he has lived a good, honest life up until, let's say, he's in his 30s or 40s, however old he is, up until that time. So perhaps 9/10 of his body or his personality is good. And there's only this 1/10 of evil, this bad side of him that he's been trying to suppress, he's been trying to hide down or push flat. And that's why that when it comes out in Mr. Hyde, he's smaller, because that 1% of him, that 1/10 of him, has not been exercised. He hasn't exercised his evil side, I suppose, so it hasn't been able to grow and develop. That's why Edward Hyde is smaller. There was no mirror at that point in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on, and for the very purpose of these transformations. Now, that accounts, if you remember in chapter 8, when they go into the cabinet, when they break in, Poole and Utterson, when it talks about the cheval glass that's in there. And as we said at the time, it seemed an unusual thing for a gentleman to have in his workroom. And as he says here, that the first time he did the transformation, he didn't have a mirror, and the one that stands next to him as he writes the letter, so some years in the future, is one that he brought there especially for the transformation. So that accounts for the cheval glass, the mirror. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of the day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard, wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder, the first creature of that sort that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. So, that first time he did the transformation, obviously he hasn't seen himself. As he says that it's the very early hours of the morning, and he talks about the inmates of my house, so the servants of his house were all locked in hours of slumber, slumber meaning sleep. So he knows that everybody in his house is fast asleep, so he decides to creep from the cabinet through the old dissecting theatre up to his bedroom so he can see himself. And he talks about how the fact that the constellations look down upon me. The constellations mean the stars. So he's talking about how the stars are looking down on him and probably wondering, so that in wonder, so in awe at the first creature of that sort that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. In other words, he's quite proud of the fact that he's probably thinking that he is the first wholly evil being that the stars will ever have seen. And it's unusual, he takes pride in this, whereas actually this is something really quite negative, talking about the personality of somebody who's 100% evil, that's fully evil. So it's the first time he talks about when he sees himself as Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be the most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just deposed. So this is once again talking about the fact that his evil side of him, Edward Hyde, is less robust, so it's not as strong. His body is physically not as strong as Jekyll's. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been less exercised and much less exhausted. Now that's a good quote. That goes on to what I said previously about the fact that he was 9/10 good, in other words, as Jekyll, and this 1/10 of him that Jekyll hid inside has now come out in a single being. So you imagine that we have Dr. Jekyll, who is 9/10 good, 1/10 evil, to make up the 100% of him. Whereas what he's done in turning himself into Edward Hyde, he's taken that 1/10 evil out of him and turned it into one complete person. Now, because of that, it means that not only is he a lot smaller physically because he's not as well exercised, the evil side of Jekyll hasn't been as allowed to come out to the forefront as much as the good side of him has been forced to do. It also means that the personality of Edward Hyde has no good within him to try and stop him doing bad things. And we've obviously seen that throughout the book so far, because we've seen that, the crimes that we saw him commit, the trampling of the little girl, the murder of Danvers Carew, were both committed on some of the weakest and most vulnerable members of society, a little girl and an elderly respected man. Obviously, we assume that perhaps Edward Hyde also did other things in between, but that they weren't all reported in the book. But certainly the ones that the reader has been told about have been very, very negative crimes. So we can see that 1/10 of evil within Jekyll that's come out into this one whole person of Edward Hyde has nothing. He has no conscience to tell him that something he's doing is wrong. And this is what he's realising here. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay. And this is where we're talking about the physicality, the facial expression, especially of Edward Hyde. Every description that we've seen of him throughout the book has talked about this feeling of deformity, of wrong. And that's, as because we've said, that's because nobody ever before has been 100% evil. Everybody has always had this kind of this balance of good and evil. Some are more good than evil, others are perhaps more evil than good, but there's still that element of good within them that sometimes does stop people doing things. But as he says here, that it was literally written on his face, the evil, and gave him this impression of deformity and decay. Decay means rot. And yet, when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather a leap of welcome. Repugnance means disgust. So he didn't feel disgust when he saw himself in the mirror as Edward Hyde. He felt this leap of welcome. So in other words, he was kind of embracing the evil within him. This too was myself. It seemed human and natural. In my eyes, it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more express and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine. So he's saying that actually he quite likes the look of Edward Hyde, because as it said, it's not compromise. It's 100% who it is. It's not like how he looked when he was Jekyll, when perhaps he was almost agonised between doing what he wanted to do and what he knew to be right, and what that the evil or the more wicked side within him was desperate to do. So as he's kind of saying that as Edward Hyde, there was a lightness about him because he wasn't being compromised by the other side of his personality or his conscience telling him to do something or not to do something. And in so far I was doubtless right. I've observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none would come near to me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. So it's talking about the way that people notice that people don't like coming near Edward Hyde without this a visible misgiving of the flesh means that they almost look quite shocked, or maybe they're kind of turned away. And we've seen everybody say that so far in the novel. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was pure evil. And that's a nice quote for this idea that he's the first human that's existed that is made up of wholly evil. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup. Once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. So he goes back to the cabinet, and the one thing that he was worried about was whether or not he'd be able to. He was stuck as this other person, as Edward Hyde. But of course, he takes the potion, he goes through the agonies of the transformation once again, and he comes back to Henry Jekyll. So he's almost got the green light now to carry on this transformation because he knows that he's safe, that he can keep going in and out of these two personalities. That night, I had come to the fatal crossroads. Fatal means leading to death. So, in hindsight, looking back on it, he knows that that was a massive turning point in his life that obviously led to the death that we know that he suffers at the end of the novel. Had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from these agonies of death and birth I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. In other words, if something terrible had happened to him, he would have come out of this very negatively. But actually, nothing bad happened. He was able to go back to being Henry Jekyll. He's able to retain his house and all his fortunes. So he comes out of this an angel instead of a fiend. So he thinks he's done something wonderful rather than something fiendish or devilish. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine. It but shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within ran forth. So he's kind of in. It's a strange point here because this is from his perspective. He's kind of saying that what he did was neither good nor bad in this experimentation. Now, of course, as a reader, we're thinking, well, actually, what you did was very terrible in these transformations because it led you to some terrible, wicked crimes. But he's saying that it was neither diabolical nor divine. All the experimentation did was change the house, as he keeps referring to it. And the house just means his physical appearance, his physical being, and let the captives of Philippi, which is a religious reference, that which stood within ran forth. In other words, it just let out something within him. The evil within him, it just let him. It just came out from being captive and came out into the world. So it's quite it's quite unpleasant here that he believes that he did nothing wrong. All he did was change his physical appearance. At that time my virtue slumbered. My evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. So once again here, this point where he says, at that time my virtue slumbered. Slumbered meaning slept. He's saying that his conscience, his virtue was asleep. So in other words, he ignored anything that was telling him not to continue. And as he refers to it here, he says, my evil was kept awake by ambition. So in other words, he now knows, looking back, that this ambition, this desperation to be the first person that's achieved these things was what drove him on. And actually, he ignored his conscience. So he knows, looking back, that as he refers to it as this fatal crossroads, this is the point where he made the decision to go down the route of evil and carrying on this experimentation when he shouldn't. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly towards the worse. Now, what he means here is that when he did the experimentation, his original idea was that he wanted to, if you imagine this is Henry Jekyll here with his 9/10 good, 1/10 evil within him, he wanted through the experimentation to take out the 10% of his evil, turn that into Mr. Hyde as a complete personality of evil, which would leave then two complete separate bodies. So his view was actually so that rather than switching between Jekyll and Hyde, he would actually be the two completely separate people. So that he would remove this 10% of evil outside of his body to stop him being tempted by evil. That could then go away and live a separate life, meaning that without that 1/10 of evil, he would then be 100% good. But the experimentation didn't work like that, of course. It wasn't a case of both living separately. It was a case of either he was Jekyll or he was Hyde. And of course, when he's Hyde, he's 100% evil. There is no good within him, which means he has no reason to ever want to go back to Jekyll because he's just doing bad things and getting away with it. Whereas when he's Dr. Jekyll, he's still got that 10% of evil within him that's desperate to keep trying to become evil. Okay, so the good of him has got both good and evil. 9/10 good, 1/10 evil, but the evil in him as Mr. Hyde is 100% evil with not not a smidgen of good. It's not like it's 9/10 evil, 1/10 good. It's not. He's 100% evil, and that's where the experimentation went wrong because he wanted them to be two separate people, so that he could carry on living as Dr. Jekyll without these constant feelings of doing something wicked or evil. But it hasn't worked. Even at that time, I had not yet conquered my aversion to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherence of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. So he's saying here that it's not that he just wanted to be Mr. Hyde all the time. He actually still enjoyed being Jekyll. He still enjoyed, as he refers to here, this dryness of a life of study. So actually, he still enjoyed being Dr. Jekyll. It's not that he wanted to be Edward Hyde 100% of the time. He enjoyed Dr. Jekyll. And he's saying that this is where it started to get a little bit awkward because he's growing. Not only is he uh, well known and highly considered. So he's very well known. He's also very well respected, and he's also growing towards the elderly man. So he was getting older, and actually this dual nature of his and this with Hyde actually became more unwelcome to him. So he kind of wanted Hyde almost gone. He wanted this as a separate person out of his life. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell in slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. So he's kind of saying here that actually he kind of fell into slavery. In other words, he was tempted by it too strongly. It becomes almost like an addiction. You need to think of this as kind of like an alcoholic or a drug addict who, once he's had a taste of it, he can't stop thinking about it. And all he has to do is take the potion, and then he, as he refers to it, um, assume like a thick cloak that of Edward Hyde. So that's similarly there, where he refers to Edward Hyde as being like a thick cloak. It's something that he can hide behind. He can hide behind the good personality, the good, honourable Dr. Jekyll can hide almost like a cloak behind Edward Hyde and do these wicked things as well. I took and furnished that house in Soho to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged as housekeeper a creature whom I well knew to be silent and unscrupulous. So it's talking about housekeeper. Unscrupulous just means very immoral. So he deliberately chose her as a housekeeper because he knew that she was quite immoral, so wouldn't say anything. On the other side, I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty and power about my house in the square. And to parry mishaps, I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character. So he's taken the house in Soho that we knew about, where he goes to after the murder of Alice Carew. And he also tells the staff at his own house, at Jekyll's house in the square, that Mr. Hyde has full liberty. Liberty means freedom, so liberty and power about his house. And he says that he even went so far as to transform into Hyde and then visit the house several times so that they became familiar with him. So we can see he was actually going to quite lengthy planning here to make sure that he's able to jump between the two personalities quite easily. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss. And pecuniary means monetary or financial. So he's explaining about the will here that Utterson hated, so that if he couldn't get back into the personality of Dr. Jekyll, he wouldn't lose out financially if he was stuck as Hyde. And thus forfeited, as I supposed, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. If you're immune to something, it means that it can't harm you. So he feels at this point as though he's a little bit invincible, as though he's covered every base. And it's almost a little bit too good to be true, the fact that he can live this good, honest life, and then he can also do these very wicked things behind closed doors and still have no financial loss. And as a reader, even though he's trying to kind of plead his case here and explain what he's done and making us feel a bit sorry for him, we will be feeling, especially the Victorian reader, will be feeling quite negative towards him. The idea that he could almost, I suppose, have his cake and eat it, so he can do everything that he wants to do without any form of retribution or any form of loss. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under the shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. So he's saying that back in the Victorian era, and actually before, some wealthy, well-respected people would hire what they call bravos to transact their crimes. In other words, they would hire unpleasant people to do their crimes for them so that they didn't get in trouble themselves. And he's saying that I was the first that could do both. And look at the language that Stevenson uses. He repeats, I was the first, I was the first. There's a real sense of pride here and arrogance about it. He's not being sort of humble about what he's done. And let's face it, what he's done is really quite significant, quite impressive, if it were true, of course, but obviously this is fiction. But he seems to have no shame for what he's done at all, only pride in what he's been able to achieve. And that's when we start to realise that he and Lanyon fell out for good reason. You can imagine that perhaps Lanyon knew and maybe a little bit of his views about this idea of the dual personality of man and wanting to separate it, but of course Lanyon didn't know that he'd actually gone so far to be able to achieve it. But we can see that someone like Lanyon, who's very traditional and very respectable, would not have agreed with any of this quite dangerous business at all. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it. I did not exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught that I had always standing ready, and whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon a mirror. And there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. So he's kind of saying here that as Edward Hyde, he doesn't exist. He can do what he wants as Edward Hyde. All he's got to do is get back to his cabinet, take the potion, and these above suspicion. Who would suspect this elderly gentleman, Henry Jekyll, would have done anything wrong? And there's a real sense of complacency here. Complacency meaning that you're quite certain about something, you don't have any doubts about anything. And complacency often leads to people making mistakes because they believe that they can never get caught. Notice here, and this is an interesting point, that Dr. Jekyll here, when he's writing this narrative, refers to Edward Hyde as he. So he's starting to think of himself as two separate people. Dr. Jekyll is himself, the first person narrative, but he refers to Edward Hyde as he in the third person. Now that's interesting because when he first started talking about the split between the two, he was saying that it wasn't anything unusual because when he looked at himself in the mirror, it was him. It was just the other side of his personality. But notice here how when there almost seems to be something, he's starting to talk about the early life of Edward Hyde and perhaps the things that he begins to do, he separates him off. It's almost his conscience's way, as Dr. Jekyll, of saying, it wasn't me, it was Edward Hyde. All right, so notice that, please. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. So he's saying here, he's saying that when he was Edward Hyde, the pleasures that he sought to do, so that the vices and the evil things were undignified, but then they grew to become monstrous. So we can see that Henry Jekyll himself realizes that things that he did as Hyde started to grow in terms of their unpleasantness. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. Depravity means something very, very sick, very dangerous and dark. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous, his every act and thought centred on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. And look at the language that's used there. We've got words like malign, villainous, depravity, bestial avidity, torture, relentless. These are all incredibly negative and unpleasant language that's used here to describe the way that he behaved. So as Henry Jekyll, you can see the negativity of the behaviour that he enacted as Edward Hyde. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde. But the situation was apart from ordinary laws and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. In other words, no matter how appalled Henry Jekyll was, he realises that he's beyond the law. The law can't catch him because Edward Hyde doesn't exist as soon as he takes the potion. And it leads us to question this idea that is if you do something wrong, is it only wrong if you are caught? Or is it wrong? Does your conscience tell you that something is wrong even though you won't get caught? And we can see here that perhaps Jekyll, even as the good Dr. Jekyll, there is something quite immoral that's growing within him. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy at which I thus connived, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it, I have no design of entering. Infamy, if something is infamous or shows infamy, it means that it's popular or famous for a negative way. So if somebody is described as behaving infamously, it means very, very negatively. And he says here that he won't go into it. He won't go into the details of it. I think even as Jekyll realises that what Hyde did was wrong. I mean but to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisements approached. Chastisements means a telling off or being in trouble. So he's starting to lead towards whatever it was that kind of put a stop to transformation. Now, we know, if you start to put the story together, we know that was probably the murder of John Carew. That was the thing that put a stop to him, that stopped his complacency. I met with one incident which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognised the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a cheque, drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. Now, this here, if you remember, this refers back to the very first chapter of the book. So the person that he talked about, your kinsman, that saw the the attack on the girl was, of course, Mr. Enfield. Right. So can you see the way that this point now is where we are joining? We're kind of joining the pieces together. This is where the novel started, even though the backstory is what we've just been told here by Henry Jekyll. Right. So he's kind of saying that one of the things that he did, which didn't really have any consequences, so he's not going to go into too much details about, was this with this young girl, where he kind of he paid them compensation to shut them up, and that was an end of it. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself. And when, by sloping my own hand backwards, I had supplied my double with a signature, I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. So once again, he thinks that he's safe. So he realises that the cheque that he wrote in Jekyll's name was a bit of a giveaway. So he sets up another bank account. He slapped his handwriting the opposite direction. And as he complacently says here, I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. So I thought I was invincible. Some 2 months before the murder of Danvers Carew, I'd been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognised the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. So he's saying here that a couple of months, 2 months before the murder of Danvers Carew, he'd gone to bed as Dr. Jekyll. He woke up in his room in the square, and even though he looked around and everything looked right, so it was the right curtains and the bed and everything, the pattern on the walls, or that sort of thing, he says that something didn't feel quite right. He felt as though he should be waking up in the little house in Soho, the apartment in Soho where he slept as Edward Hyde. And this is where the first time that he started to realise that the experimentation wasn't quite going right. So he knows that something's not quite right. He just kept dozing off. He was quite happy, kept dozing off back to sleep. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eye fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely. But the hand which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light in the mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. Now, as bizarre as that seems, that's quite an interesting comparison if you juxtapose the descriptions of the two hands. So his hand as Dr. Jekyll, it refers to it as professional, because obviously he's a doctor. It talks about it as being large, white, firm. So this is a solid hand. This is the hand of a good, solid man. But then the hand that he looks down and sees on the bed covers, that of Edward Hyde, it's referred to as lean and corded. Corded means all sort of gnarled and knobbly with the veins poking through. It was knuckly, of a dusky pallor, so it's slightly darker, so it's not white, it's a darker shade, and thickly shaded with a growth of hair. Now that's an interesting point because, as we talked about before with the theory of evolution, the belief that humans were evolved from the apes, there's almost a reference to him almost being something ape-like here. And so perhaps Stevenson is touching on the idea that as the good Dr. Jekyll, he was created by God, but as Edward Hyde, this is a thing of evil that's created through evolution. So what's happened is basically he's gone to bed as Dr. Jekyll, and without having taken the potion, he's transformed at some point during the night into Edward Hyde without even realising it. So this is quite dangerous because it suggests that his body is starting to react very differently to the potion now. He doesn't necessarily need the potion. Perhaps he dreamt some wicked thoughts, and it's that turned him into Edward Hyde without him realising it. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was this to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. a long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theatre, from where I was then standing horror-struck. So he's realised that not only has he woken up in the body of Edward Hyde, but he's also quite a long way from his cabinet where he's got the drugs. And it's getting on in the morning. His servants are going to be up by this point, so he's wondering how he's going to manage to get through the house undetected to get the potion to turn himself back into Dr. Jekyll. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature, so in his height? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed as well as I was able in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw started and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and in such a strange array. And 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint at breakfasting. Now, it would be odd enough anyway to have somebody that's a relative stranger in your house, but don't forget we're going back to Victorian era, and it just wouldn't be a gentlemanly thing to do to have a guest in your house that the servants didn't know about. And yes, they probably would have people, visitors that would stay over, but certainly not one that wouldn't have been introduced to the servants for a room to have been made up for him, and certainly one that would be wandering around the house on his own without his host Henry Jekyll. So then he makes a feint of breakfasting, in other words, a lie of breakfasting. So he comes back down as Dr. Jekyll and pretends that everything's fine. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall to be spelling out the letters of my judgment. And I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. Now, this reference to the Babylonian finger, it's another biblical story, and it's what's known as the Finger of Babylon. And it was this mysterious kind of hand that wrote on the wall, and he wrote the fate of people on the wall. So that's why we get the phrase, the writings on the wall, and it's the idea that your fate is kind of written for you. And he's kind of saying here that this change in the middle of the night without taking the potion, without him realising it, from Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde, is almost like this warning, this warning of fate to him that actually he kind of ignored, and it made him sort of reflect more seriously than ever before on the possibilities of a double existence, and the belief that maybe as Edward Hyde, the more that he became Edward Hyde, the stronger that part of his personality became, the more likely it was that he would start turning into Edward Hyde without him taking the potion. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. So this is what I mean about him doing more as Edward Hyde, and therefore that part of his personality becoming stronger. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I was conscious of a more generous tide of blood. And I began to spy danger that if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. So, as he's saying here, that he's starting to notice in these recent transformations into Edward Hyde, that he's started to grow a little bit in height. And it's this idea that that 1/10 evil that became Edward Hyde is perhaps changing that balance. So rather than it perhaps being 9/10 good, 1/10 evil, the balance is starting to kind of move a little bit here. And he's worrying that maybe he won't be able to voluntarily change into Edward Hyde, that this might be something that his body starts automatically doing, and he might be stuck in the personality of Edward Hyde forever. The power of the drug had not always been displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then, I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once, with infinite risk of death, to treble the amount. And these rare uncertainties had hitherto cast the sole shadow on my contentment. So he's kind of saying here that the first time he took the potion, he only needed to take one dose of it, but there's been times recently he's had to take more and more to transform back into Dr. Jekyll. And if you remember the notebook in chapter 9 that Lanyon referred to, that had all these scribblings over it and dates and quantities, where it's things like double or treble, whatever, or failed, this is actually a reference to that. So this realization that the more often that he becomes Hyde, the harder it is, and the more potion he has to take to turn back into Jekyll. Now, however, in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to overthrow the body, throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other things. In other words, it used to be hard for him to change from Jekyll to Hyde, but now it's harder for him to change from Hyde to Jekyll, so the evil within him is growing. All things, therefore, seem to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Right, that's halfway through the chapter then. So I will put this in the first part of the video, and then I will do another one after half term for part two. But that note there, we said he was becoming slowly incorporated, my second and worse. He's kind of realizing that he perhaps is erring more towards the side of Edward Hyde, whether he likes it or not. The potion has brought too many changes on him, and the more that he's become Edward Hyde, the more the bad side of him has started to be developed, and it's almost as though that balance is such now that he can't change back even if he wanted to. So we can see that the damage is really starting to set in now. Okay, I shall see you next week.